All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed your tour of Mount Vernon and had a chance to really explore and understand the history and how Washington really had this vision to expand the house and the surrounding area. And many like him really sort of used their home and their surroundings as almost an expression of themselves. And we probably get the best example of that really from Jefferson's Monticello, right? Jefferson was sort of our Renaissance founding father, right? In that he was a man talented in a number of different areas, and his house reflects that. And I think to a certain extent, Washington's does the same, in that Washington's reflects the practicality of the man, in that he was constantly wanting to do things that were not necessarily exorbitant, but practical, right? And I think we almost see that within the way that the house was built and the way that they used that sort of faux wood look on the finish of the house, right? That it was the much more cheaper and economical way to go, but the practicality of the appearance of it too, I think, is something that is very Washington-like. Okay. So what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about slavery at Mount Vernon, right? And this is an interesting graphic to sort of start us off with that conversation. And then I'm just going to sort of talk about slavery and really slavery in Washington's life through a timeline that we'll track over a couple slides here, right? But this is an example of what Mount Vernon would have looked like in 1799, which would have been the year that Washington died. Um, and you can see that the number of enslaved individuals that were working at Mount Vernon, compared to the hired white servants, and then the Washington family members is just startling to see. The majority of blue on this graphic that we see here, right? And this needs to be understood. And I think as I teach slavery in the South to my students, the one thing we assume is that this is what all of the plantations in the South look like. In fact, this is part of the reason why Washington and others like him were in that sort of social stratosphere that they were, because this is not very common that one would have the amount of resources and funds to have this many enslaved individuals. I think most farms in the South would have operated with a small fraction of the number of enslaved individuals to run the farm. So when you see the plantations that sort of exist today as homes, still you sort of see this number and get a thought this is how they all operated. All the plantations in the South operated, and that is not the case, right? So and again, we're going to see that Washington is not really responsible for nearly half of these slaves, and in that it was with his marriage to Martha Washington that many of these slaves come to Mount Vernon, right? So let's go ahead and see if we can't focus a little bit on slavery, not only at Mount Vernon, but in the life of George Washington as well. So we start our story in 1750. Washington is come of age so that he now has control. He's 18 in 1750. And through that comes into control of 11 enslaved individuals that inherited from his father, Augustine, right? Augustine dies when Washington is a child. And so through the will of Augustine, when Washington came of age, he would inherit these 11 slaves. And so uh, Washington, throughout his lifetime, will inherit 23 enslaved people from his family, right? But it really is startling to see what happens in 1759 with the marriage of Washington to Martha Dandridge Custis, who brings 84 enslaved people to Mount Vernon as part of her dower share. Now, this will be something that Washington will pay close attention to throughout his life, because these dower slaves, as they were called, meaning that they were part of the Custis estate, um, Martha Washington has the rights to these individuals, but doesn't legally own them. The estate does. Okay, so Washington, in particular, will be financially on the hook for these dower slaves that run away. And so there are examples that we see, and probably the most famous is when Ona Judge runs away from the president's house in Philadelphia and goes to, I believe, Vermont. But he does pursue her rather diligently because of the fact that she's a dower slave and will wind up financially hurting Washington in the long run. Okay. Um, by 1799, there are 153 of these dower slaves that are at Mount Vernon. Okay, and that's through natural increase as children inherited the status of their mother. Okay, we move on. 1766. This is an example of Washington sort of being the stern father. Washington wasn't particularly known for physical abuse of the slaves, um, but he would oftentimes, not often, but on rare occasions, make exceptions by selling the slaves away. And we see this example in 1766 when Tom, who was a foreman, is sold sold to a sugar plantation owner in the West Indies as punishment for running away. Okay, now we have all kinds of examples of what slave owners would have done to runaways that were caught, and most of that time would have been making some sort of an example to them through either lashing of the back or some sort of physical abuse. In this case, Washington chose to sell the slave. And it's interesting also to read there, enslaved people left Mount Vernon when they were sold, escaped successfully, or died. Okay, that's really the only way. 1768, Washington at this point in his life is through the French and Indian Wars, back to being a farmer, back to running the plantation, okay, and adding to the amount of slaves. Now, this purchase is in particularly important, right? His purchase of 148 pounds to a Virginia widow for 4 individuals, William and Frank Lee, because William Lee will be really Washington's body servant throughout the American Revolution. And a lot of paintings that we see are of Washington and Billy Lee in the background. Okay. That was his body servant until Billy Lee is actually injured. And then we sort of see the callousness, right, of the slave owner and the slave, because, you know, Washington has gone through all of this with Billy Lee, and it really has sort of gained a trust. And then Billy Lee is injured and is really no longer to ride alongside Washington, and basically is just cast away and sent back to Mount Vernon. And is sort of just, you know, that sense of this slave as property is evident when Billy Lee no longer serves as useful for Washington. And so we see that callousness that exists there, right? Interesting that we see this idea of the use of a midwife to attend to female slaves during their childbirth. At least 293 babies were born to enslaved women at Mount Vernon between 1750 and 1799. Interesting to see the generational impact that has on slaves throughout the South. In 1786, now Washington at this point is getting ready. He's about a year away from attending the Constitutional Convention and entering into that stage of his life. The American Revolution has completed. And he begins renting slaves from his neighbor Penelope French. And this would have been sort of an economical thing for Washington to do, to not purchase, but rent, because you didn't have to provide all of the resources needed to house the slaves, feed the slaves, clothe the slaves, right? So this would have been something that would have been done more so towards the end of Washington's life, right? By 1800, Washington has passed away. The rented slaves are returned to their owners, right? Now, the small number of individuals, but at this point through natural increases, expanded about 120. The slaves that Washington owned outright are emancipated, okay? And this is a historical argument that oftentimes is had in that. Um, I think it goes along with our discussion of this buildup of Washington as being this sort of like godlike figure who could possibly do no wrong. So of course, look, he freed his slaves too, as sort of this um, moral action, and so there's a lot of historical argument into that. Sort of overplay, in my opinion, I think, of Washington freeing his slaves outright. But more importantly, and I think this is also something interesting to see, is that look at the one for 1802. After Martha Washington's death, the people owned by the Custis estate, about 150 individuals, are dispersed to Martha's 4 grandchildren. There's also a clause in there that some of these slaves would have been, and I believe these were the slaves that Washington owned, that upon Martha Washington's death, those slaves that Washington owned would be free. So, imagine Martha sort of looking over her shoulder as all of these individuals are waiting for her to die in order to gain their freedom. So she actually is the one, I believe, in 1801 who grants them their freedom outright. And then part of the reason Ona Judge ran away when she was in Philadelphia was that she was, at that point, she was Martha Washington's, one of her body servants. And she was being given as a wedding gift to a relative of Martha that was known for being not very kind. And rather than meet that fate, ran away, right? So slavery at Mount Vernon is something that can't be ignored. The farm, the plantation would not have been able to run without it. And I think Mount Vernon has done a fantastic job of really building that narrative into the story. They're just closing up an exhibit on slavery at Mount Vernon that was just getting started when I began my fellowship down there. So I had a chance to see sort of behind the scenes interaction of that. So that was really interesting to see as well. All right, so I want to move on, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the trades that existed at Mount Vernon. So I'm going to go ahead and end this video now, and then we'll jump into the trades.